Oh, good to see you again. This is a study on Acts 21, the second half. And I like to think of this as a profile in courage. I borrowed the phrase from John F. Kennedy in his book, which won the Pulitzer Prize, by the way, for individuals whose courage changed history. In our society, courage is exemplified by the Congressional Medal of Honor, our highest award. But what strikes me is the person receiving it often says something like, I just saw what needed to be done and I did it. It wasn't a considered judgment. It wasn't something they thought it out carefully to do. It was a response to a critical need and a sense of responsibility. And courage often is an act of faith. It's doing what needs to be done and loving others more than self. Isn't that a definition of love? Well, we're going to read Acts 21, 26 to 30. I love this picture of the duck and the cat. Why can't we get along? Well, this will be a profile in courage. And it begins, the next day, Paul took the men and purified themselves, or himself, along with them. And then he went to the temple to give advice, to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end and the offering would be made for each of them. And when the 7 days were nearly over, some of the Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and they seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us! This is the man who teaches everyone, everywhere, against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he has brought the Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul and assumed that Paul had brought him to the temple. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions, seizing Paul, and they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. Let's pause here and just look a little bit. Paul just returned from his third missionary journey. It's Pentecost. The city's swollen with pilgrims from all over the known world, and surely there were some from Asia and Ephesus where Paul had preached effectively. And Paul's just reported to the elders in Jerusalem, and they praised God for what Paul's accomplished. But Paul's under heavy criticism by the officials in Israel, the fellow Christians who were Jewish. And he was seen as a Jew who had stepped away from the traditions of the faith. And they thought that he had denied that a Jew should be circumcised, even though he told Timothy to do it on his second missionary journey when he was in Troas, because Timothy had a Jewish mother. The Hebrew Christians thought he was telling them to forsake the laws of Moses. Much of their information, though, was rumor quality. And interestingly, the church leaders had not silenced the criticism. At least they had not been effective. Hadn't they promulgated the Jerusalem Council, where they directed that there were certain things that Gentile converts should do? They didn't say that Jews weren't supposed to be circumcised or do the traditional things that Jews did. Well, Paul has just returned from his third missionary journey, and, sometimes we allow criticism when we're secretly suspicious or jealous ourselves. The leaders just didn't stand up effectively for Paul, and so they told him to stand up for himself. And sorry about that. Well, it's church business. Well, the leaders didn't stand up effectively for Paul. And in 21:23 it said, "Therefore, do what we will tell you." Now that's not a suggestion, that's a command. And they tell him to take 4 men and pay their way for a week of purification. Now remember that Paul's not adverse to a Nazirite type vow. In fact, on his second missionary journey in 1818, he completed one. But what they're asking is actually an affront to his integrity. Regardless, Paul was serving God and not Paul. And so he complied in the hopes of keeping peace and making a good name for the church. But Paul foreknew that he would suffer and be bound in Jerusalem. In fact, in Acts 20, recall that it says that the Holy Spirit testifies to me in every city that imprisonment and afflictions await me. Now his Nazirite vow consisted of abstention from eating meat and drinking wine, and at the end he was to shave his head as an outward sign of an inner commitment to God and the law. He was also to give a lamb as a sin offering and a ram as a peace offering. And there'd be meat and drink offerings and a basket of unleavened bread. And then at the concluding 7 days, they would spend their time in the temple courts. And Paul was paying for himself and for others, so that was a significant expense. He also would be paying for lost wages because they're taking all this time off to purify themselves. So it was a real commitment that he was making. And he was therefore appealing to the legalists by being a conformist. You know the old saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. Problem is that legalists are rarely satisfied. Often their pursuit of structure and rules is a crutch to atone for their own inadequacies. So they focus now on Trophimus in verse 29. And he's a young Greek. We saw him in Acts 24, where he and several others had come with Paul at the end of the third missionary journey to Jerusalem, bringing alms to the people there. Now, they were confused. The people in the temple area were confused. They thought that Trophimus was violating the customs of the church, that he was, because he was from Asia, probably from Ephesus, they assumed that Paul had taken him into the temple area in verse 29. Assumptions are often dangerous. Notice how the word begins. They can be a chink in the armor which the father of lies can use to wound us. Assumptions are dangerous. And mobs are often stirred by prejudice and innuendo and not by facts or reason. Boy, they had outrageous hyperbole too. They said, he's teaching everyone, come on, everywhere. That's crazy. Against our people, not against our God, against our people, against themselves, against their race. That's not blasphemy, that's racism. And they were wrong on at least those 3 counts. So in 30, they dragged Paul from the temple, and they took him likely between the court of the women and the court of the Gentiles. Let's look at this beautiful picture here. And this gate is the gate through which they would go into the court of the women. Women were allowed to come in here but could not proceed further towards the temple. This area over here and over here is the court of the Gentiles. And they would be allowed there to congregate. This is the gate through which they would go into the court of the women. They were under full view of the Antonia fortress, which was over here. When the riot began, the Levites closed the gate here to keep people from going in, to keep people out of the inner portion of the temple, to keep people out of God's presence. And isn't it ironic that the last time that Paul is at the temple, the gates are slammed shut to keep him out? They were protecting God from Paul's perceived apostasy. And of course, they really wanted to limit the riot to a certain area. But symbolically, they closed the gates of their minds. They closed the gates of justice. And they closed the gates of accountability before God. In their religious fervor, they bore false witness in violation of the ninth commandment. You see, there was no court. Justice demands that the accused be heard dispassionately, that they give their voice. They assumed the role of judge and jury, and they prejudged and they condemned, and that's false witness. In their religious fervor, they sought to violate the 6th commandment, thou shalt not kill. Jesus said, if you kill in your heart, you're guilty of murder. Well, they're doing more than that. They're beating him, and they're trying to beat him to death. And in their religious fervor, they violated the 2nd commandment. And that's maybe not so obvious. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. But remember that Micah 6:8 says, and what does the Lord require of you? Require of you to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. It dishonors God to act unjustly. It dishonors his name. If Paul was perceived as a blasphemer, there were orderly procedures for charging him and trying him, but they ignored all those. They closed the gates of their minds to salvation. They closed the gates of the temple where they might meet the living God. Let's read now 31 through 36. It says, while they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He, that is a commander, at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. And when the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. And then he, that is a commander, asked who he was, who Paul was, and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, get rid of him. Well, in verse 31 it says, while they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops. Let's look again at this model that was created in Jerusalem of the ancient holy city. And as I mentioned, the Antonia fortress stands near the temple grounds, but it's higher than the temple. This area is higher than it. And you can imagine that they would have a sentry on each one of these towers, and they could look over a portion of the city. And it galled the Jews that they could look over the court of the Gentiles. They could look into the court of the women. They could see what was going on around the temple. It was a source of great resentment. It was a place where the commander would be, likely where Pontius Pilate was. Remember, he came to Jerusalem during the Passover, put his shields around the building. That really offended the people because in those days it had an image of Caesar on it, and Caesar was a god to the Romans, and that was blasphemy and offensive. And so he finally took him down and went back to Caesarea Maritima. But they are here on the top. And, the other thing that occurs to me is, remember the cock crowed and Peter had denied 3 times? Some people believe that the cock crow was someone blowing the horn on the top of the Antonia fortress. So it would be heard all over the city. And that was a call to change the guards. And that was called the cock's crow by the Romans at that time. Well, the commander had 2 top priorities. Number 1, get the taxes, get the money, send it back to Rome. And number 2, keep the peace. That was his main job. Taxes, keep the peace. And so in verse 32, it said he at once took some officers and soldiers. Now, we learn in chapter 23, his name was Claudius Lysias. And he came down from the Antonia fortress, so it's a close-up. And you can imagine there were roughly 1,000 soldiers at that time there, and they came out and into the courtyard. This Antonia fortress was built by the Hasmoneans in the intratestamentary period. It would protect the north side of the temple, and Herod the Great, added on to this and made it reinforced. He also renamed it in honor of Mark Antony. Mark Antony, remember, he and Cleopatra rose up against Octavian, who later became Caesar Augustus, and he and Cleopatra were killed following the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Herod the Great supported Mark Antony, and when he realized he picked the wrong horse, he went to Octavian and said, I will be as faithful to you as I was to Mark Antony. I picked the wrong man. Forgive me. And Octavian did. He liked him as a ruler in that area. So Herod went on to build this tremendous, reinforce it. So you have now the soldiers running down to where all of this stuff is going on. And this is a typical formation. There probably was a larger group. It said that he took officers and soldiers. An officer would be a centurion, which would be in charge of 100 soldiers, or a publican, who would be like a sergeant or a corporal. But regardless, likely the commander was in the center, and they were in this formation, and see the sword sticking out. You're not going to mess with them. And of course, right away, people step back. And that's what it says in verse 32. They stopped beating Paul. You darn right they did. But Paul probably was now lying on the ground, bloody and beaten. And he probably had not been closer to death than this. I mean, he'd been beaten, remember, in Philippi with the sticks, the rods that were part of the fasces. If you have an American dime, turn it over the back and you'll see an interesting thing with an axe on it. That's called the fasces, and those sticks were used to apply justice, so they would beat a person. And that happened to him in Philippi. He was beaten multiple times. But they were trying to kill him, not just punish him. Isn't it remarkable, though, that he's saved essentially by Roman justice, not Jewish justice, and the Romans prevent his death. And immediately they bind him with 2 chains, one on each wrist, and it gives this image of arms stretched out. And does that remind you of anyone? But that's how they treated a criminal. Again, I apologize. I normally get 2 calls a week, and to get them in the same half hour, that's truly remarkable. Well, they stopped beating Paul, and Paul, he was probably close to death at this point. They treated him like a criminal, and they asked him, what had he done? They assumed that he was at fault, and that's not unreasonable. If somebody were in our church and the parishioners were beating him and the police arrived, they would assume that the person being beaten in the church was probably at fault. It's not an unreasonable assumption, but they were shouting conflicting stories, and it was an uproar, and they couldn't agree on what Paul had done. And that's really characteristic of ignorance and assumption. Now, the author, the commander Lysias, wasn't judging Paul. He was just trying to establish the peace. He was there to maintain order. And the crowd is yelling, kill him, kill him. Arioteuton is the Greek there. And remarkably, it's the same words used by Luke when he describes the people demanding that Pilate put Jesus to death rather than Barabbas. So in Luke 23:18 it says, but the whole crowd shouted, away with the man, Arioteuton, same words, release Barabbas to us. So surely they picked Paul up at this point by the armpits and walked him to the Antonia fortress in the midst of soldiers. And Paul is now safe. No charges are going to be made that'll stick. He's a Roman citizen. His release is guaranteed at this point. So what's he do? Let me read this part. As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, may I say something to you? Do you speak Greek? The commander replied. Aren't you the Egyptian who started the revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out of the wilderness some time ago? Paul answered, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd, and when they were all silent, he said to them in Aramaic. Now, this is really interesting. Paul calmly speaks in Greek to the commander, and the commander's surprised. "You speak Greek?" He's confused because he thinks this is just a common person, another miscreant. And then he says, "Aren't you the Egyptian?" You see, Josephus describes in 54 AD, that was about 3 years before this, there was an Egyptian who led desperate men to the Mount of Olives, and he promised them that he'd make the walls of the city fall down in front of him. They were just dagger bearers. They were nationalists. In fact, Josephus said they were led some 30,000 people, not 4,000. But Governor Felix then dispatched troops and crushed the revolt. And hundreds were killed or captured. And the Egyptian escaped. And he was put on the most wanted list. And so Lysias, the commander, thinks that maybe this is that most wanted Egyptian. But Paul disarms Claudius Lysias by speaking calmly in Greek, and that establishes some common ground, and it shows that Paul is a cultured, educated man, and it disarms the commander. Paul didn't make it clear at this point that he was a Roman citizen. He's holding that back. Well, at this point, Paul is home free. He could have just gone in, revealed that he's a Roman citizen, and be gone, but he asks for it. He has lots of bruises and cuts, and he could have gone on his own recognizance. But he asked for it. He steps on the steps there to the Antonia fortress, and he asks to speak to the crowd, this rabid crowd, who were unreasonable. They had just beat him, and they tried to kill him. But Paul's technique is always to speak to people face to face. And miraculously, the people fall silent. Maybe they were stunned. Who knows? And the commander was after peace, which he now had, and understanding. So he must have had a translator, because Paul speaks to them in Aramaic. He's speaking the language of the common man. It's the language Jesus spoke. There are a number of words that are preserved in the Bible that are Aramaic, like Talitha Kum and Epaphratha. Remember, that's when Jesus opened the ears of the deaf man. Abba, Racha, Mammon, Rabboni, Maranatha, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, Jot and Tittle, Korban, Hosanna. Well, Jesus spoke in Aramaic, and Paul spoke in Aramaic, and it suggests the commander either understood the language or had a translator there. So just to picture this, he's beaten, he's disheveled, he's in chains, he's under control of the Roman guards, but Paul is in charge, and he's ready to preach the gospel, ready to face the consequences. Now, he doesn't hit him with theology. He tells his story, his personal experience, and that's one of the most unanswerable arguments on earth. But it's not foolproof, and I emphasize the word fool. Paul gives his testimony or his apology, and he says, "Brothers and fathers, listen now to my defense." When they heard him speak in Aramaic, they became very quiet, and then Paul said, "I am a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel and was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was zealous for God, as are any of you today. I persecuted the followers." I lost my place. There we go. "I persecuted the followers of the way to their death, and arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priests and all their council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus, and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. About noon, as I came near Damascus, suddenly a bright light from heaven flashed around me. I fell to the ground and heard a voice say to me, 'Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?' 'Who are you, Lord?' I asked. 'I am Jesus of Nazareth, whom you are persecuting,' he replied. My companions saw the light, but they did not understand the voice of him who was speaking to me. What shall I do, Lord? I asked. Get up, the Lord said. Go to Damascus, and there you will be told all that you've been assigned to do. And my companions led me by the hand into Damascus, because the brilliance of the light had blinded me. A man named Ananias came to see me, and he was a devout observer of the law and highly respected by all the Jews living there. He stood beside me and said, Brother Saul, receive your sight. And at that very moment I was able to see him. And then he said, The God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one, to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. And now, what are you waiting for? Get up and be baptized and wash your sins away, calling on his name. When I returned to Jerusalem and was praying at the temple, I fell into a trance and saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to the other to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Then the Lord said to me, Go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. Well, Paul's given his own testimony, his apology. And Tarsus, just a few notes here. Tarsus was the mouth of the river Cydnus. It was a terminus for the people across Asia as they trade, went back and forth, ultimately towards Rome. It was a great university city. It was an important city. And Paul was a rabbi. He studied under Gamaliel, who was himself called the glory of the law. He had died 5 years before, and Paul was a Pharisee. He knew more about the law than 99% of those in the mob. He had education. He had recognition because he was tested by other Pharisees to make sure he understood the law, knew the law, could recite the law. He was a man who was there to refute misinterpretations of the law. They weren't. But he was a persecutor. He'd been zealous for the law, just like them. It was widely known. It was indisputable. But he had changed. His conversion was not a defection. It was a change of mind, a change of heart. And it was a conversion by divine intervention. So at noon, that's a real time, on a road to Damascus, a real place, he had been blinded, a real disability. The witnesses had to help him complete his journey. And while blind, he met the righteous one. That is a term used for, it's a messianic term used for the Messiah, Jesus. And a real man, Ananias, a Jewish man of God, a respected man, reluctantly, but by God's direction, restored Paul's sight. These were real, witness, physical experiences. Paul does not refer directly to the Old Testament or give some theological exposition. Everything is experiential. He confesses that he too made wrong assumptions, and they led to the death of Stephen. And in a sense, he was no better than the rioters. He wasn't claiming to be, but now he was an evangelist to those he had persecuted. And then he ends with, Jesus saying, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. And here the crowd goes wild. Surely he suspected this would be the result, but he didn't minimize or avoid the truth. He said what was on his heart and what was true. And we should always be prepared to give our apology. Paul glorified Christ and he dignified the Christian movement. And what was the response? Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. The first time I gave my witness, the response was, well, that was okay for you. And then that person minimized what I said. But I realized afterwards that we're not called to convince. we're called to bear witness. We're called to place God first, regardless of the personal consequences, embarrassment or whatever. We're not to be offensive, and we're to walk humbly before our God. And God will reward us in his own way. For Paul, this began a downhill spiral of threats of death and trial, imprisonment, and finally martyrdom. Well, normally at this point, we would have comments. Oh, yes, I left this out, an important part. Paul, this is the response to the crowd. Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live. And then I would ask for comments. We've seen a great profile in courage. The question is, why can't we live together? And so I want to end, as I have for the last several weeks, talking about 10 martyrs that are celebrated in the newest addition to Westminster Abbey in 1998 above the Great West Door. And we first met Maximilian Kolbe. We're going to talk about the 5th person today. But we met Maximilian Kolbe, who volunteered in Auschwitz to be starved to death in the place of another man. Amanshi Masamola, who's from South Africa and was murdered by her parents when she tried to be baptized as a Christian. And Janani Lumwum from Uganda, who stood up to Idi Amin to try to end the extrajudicial killings and political repression and the corruption and ethnic persecution. And then the Grand Duchess Elizabeth of Russia, she's the granddaughter of the Tsar Paul, and was wealthy. I mean, she gave it all up when her husband was murdered to become a nun. She sold her property and with that started a hospital. And she was violently murdered by the communists in 1918. And this time we have Martin Luther King. And you all know his story, but it bears repeating. He was born in 1929 in Atlanta, Georgia, as Michael King, and his father changed his name and his son's name in 1934 when he went to Germany to attend the 5th Baptist World Alliance Congress. His father was a strict disciplinarian, and Martin Luther King Jr. Suffered depression through much of his life. As a teen, though, he was ordered to stand so a white person could be seated on a bus, and he said that that was the angriest that he'd ever been in his life. He subsequently graduated from Crozer Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, with a Bachelor of Divinity in 1951, and then he married Coretta Scott in 1953. They had 4 children. He got a PhD from Boston University in 1955. And he had a strong faith, and it was based on Jesus' commandment to love your neighbor as yourself and love God above all, and love your enemies and pray for them and bless them. So as he entered the civil rights arena, he was mentored by activists who believed in nonviolence, and he admired Mahatma Gandhi. And in 1955, on a Montgomery bus, there was a 15-year-old girl who refused to give up her bus seat under the Jim Crow laws. And they chose not to back her because she was unmarried and pregnant, and they looked for a better case, and Rosa Parks came along. She refused to give up her seat, and King led a boycott that lasted 385 days. His house was bombed, and he was arrested, but the U.S. District Court ruled to end segregation on all Montgomery buses, and that transformed Martin Luther King Jr. into a national figure. He led marches that ultimately resulted in the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act in 1965. In 1963, there was segregation in Birmingham, and you've seen the pictures. Bull Connor used water guns and police dogs against the protesters, and it shocked America. And King was arrested and jailed for the 13th of the 29 times. And he wrote a letter from the Birmingham jail, and I want to quote 2 things from it, because this was his darkest hour. But the first observation was, we know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. True. And he wondered, where are the white Christians? And he wrote, almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride for freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice, who constantly says, I agree with you in your goal, but I cannot agree with your methods of direct action, who paternalistically believes he can set the timetable for another man's freedom, who lives by a mythical concept of time, who is constantly advising the Negro to wait for a more convenient season. Ouch. Well, in the March on Washington in 1963, it was designed originally to portray the desperate condition of the blacks in the southern U.S., and it was an opportunity to bring grievances squarely to the seat of power in the nation's capital. And there were specific demands, and that was to end racial segregation in public schools. And they wanted meaningful civil rights legislation. And it was at that time that we had I Have a Dream speech. They wanted laws prohibiting discrimination in employment, protection of civil rights from police brutality. Still working on that one. And a $2 minimum wage for all workers. $2. In 1966, after several successes in the South, he tried to spread the movement to the North, which Chicago was his goal. And in 1968, he organized the Poor People's Campaign to address issues of economic justice. But on March 29, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, when he went to support the black sanitary public worker employees who were paid $2 for, he was paid for 2 hours of work and sent home for bad weather, while the whites got a full day's pay. He was shot through the right cheek, into the spinal cord, and the bullet lodged in his shoulder. He died an hour later in spite of emergency surgery, and he was 39 years old. James Earl Ray was captured in London Heathrow Airport trying to leave the United Kingdom. He had a false Canadian passport and he was on his way to Rhodesia. He confessed and then recanted 3 days later, but he was subsequently sentenced to 99 years and he spent the rest of his life denying. Martin Luther King Jr. is the 5th person in the middle at Westminster Abbey. And we're still trying to establish civil rights. Thank you for watching. May God bless you.